Artists say the new copyright amendment bill will have dire consequences for local creatives if indeed it is signed into law. It's scheduled to be before Parliament tomorrow as artists call on lawmakers to reject the draft law. Let's bring in Jack Devnarain, who is the chairperson of the South African Guild of Actors. Jack, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. I mean, it's interesting to take a look at the numbers from when this bill was previously before Parliament, 2022. It was passed by 210 votes, only 45 MPs voted against it. Do you reckon there's a lack of understanding of just exactly how negatively some parts of this bill do impact particularly the film and television industry?
Yeah, I think it's also a myth to say that people have or are largely opposed to the bills. I think quite the opposite, in fact. I think what we have is some very strong and some very articulate groups that are within the creative sector that are trying to be heard, that are trying to establish a certain narrative. And it's disappointing, really, because ultimately what we are seeing, and certainly tomorrow we will be seeing in Parliament, this is a culmination of a process that's been going on for nearly 10 years. And we are absolutely delighted as the South African Guild of Actors that we are going to see some progress, because we know that the wheels of the legislature turn slowly. We know that there are extensive stakeholder engagements that need to happen, and that's part of a process. So we are delighted that we have finally reached that point after years of stakeholder engagements, after years of, engaging in Parliament, taking the bills out to the provinces. And through all of that, there persists an agenda that is still fundamentally opposed to industry transformation, and I think that's the real concern for us.
Yeah. I want to talk more about that agenda that you're talking about, but let's talk about the problematic parts of the bill, right? And it sounds like the fair use provisions in the bill perhaps are at the top of the list of what creatives have a problem with.
Yeah, and I suppose that's largely to do with certain commercial groups, certain interest groups that have that are driven by a profit imperative. These are organizations that need to avoid industry regulation at all costs. They need to avoid revising legislation at all costs. They need to oppose the transformative agenda at all costs. So what they have done is that they've stood up to say that if we have to transform our copyright regime from 1978, then it's not going to suit us. And we also have international studios, international publishers that are saying, if you as South Africans have to exercise your sovereign right to transform your legislation, then we as international producers, international studios are going to have a problem with that. So that's the kind of narrative that's been pushed. And of course it's a matter of concern for us because yes, fair use is at the top of a highly controversial list. However, let's understand what fair use is. Now, fair use is a legitimate means by which material can be shared fairly. And it's part of any copyright regime. Now, those who oppose fair sharing are those people who are saying fair use is theft. Now, at a very basic level, you can already see the problem with that. Because if you're going to lie about something, if you're going to misrepresent something that is legally sound, something that is practiced internationally as part of a standard form of copyright sharing, copyright use, and it is an exception to copyright ownership, then you are misrepresenting it, and that is what we are trying to help people to understand. Don't fall for the misrepresentation.
So, Jack, you're saying fair use, okay? And is the problem those who are against this particular part, this particular provision, this fair use provision, would it be fair to say, we're saying fair a lot in this conversation, but is it correct to say that the people who are making use of this creative content, the people, the organizations, the government entities, are actually not doing so fairly. And that's what the creatives have a problem with, because fair use is one thing, but are we sticking to what the definition of fair use is the question.
Well, fair use is defined in the bills, and there's a very simple process to say if somebody is using copyrighted material unfairly without paying for it and without acknowledging the original author, then that is a violation of copyright law.
Right.
And a violation of copyright law will automatically incur, it will invoke the law that allows for some kind of prosecution or some recourse against the person who is stealing the copyright material. What fair use allows for is the legitimate sharing of content, the legitimate use of content that does not incur copyright protection. There are exceptions to copyright protection, and we are exercising that in the form of fair use. So we've got to be very clear about what are the objectives of fair use. And objectives are clearly to make material available. If you remember, some years ago, I'm afraid many South Africans have forgotten what fees must fall was all about. And what we are saying is that people have a right, under certain circumstances, to be able to use material that is copyright protected, but without having to pay for it. Now, a lot of people are saying, yes, that's theft. And what the supporters of the bills are saying is that no, it is not theft. It is a legitimate, legal, and viable exception to copyright because it's contained under certain circumstances.
Right.
And we've got to be very careful not to run away with the idea that we are being pursued and hounded by a draconian government that is trying to steal what we have. That is not the purpose of fair use, and that's certainly not the objectives of transforming laws that were drafted in 1978, which actually did seek to overregulate and to create a draconian regime that was not friendly to copyright users and authors.
Yeah, but the thing is, Jack, as I understand it, if indeed you have used my work in a manner that goes against the fair use provision, I would then need to take you to court, right? And I would need the money to do so.
Yes, and that is why the copyright bill makes provision for a tribunal, which is mandated by the Act itself, to say, we understand that if you are going to litigate against some copyright violation, typically it's going to be a very expensive exercise in civil court. That is why we have created a tribunal. That is why it's going to short-circuit the process. It's going to be specifically focused on copyright issues, and you're welcome to exercise that as a form of recourse.
Right. I'm reading a lot about the global network of authors who are against the adoption of the bill, Jack, talking about, if indeed it is adopted, it will harm South Africa's creative community. It will devalue creators' work. It will be out of step with international best practice. Is that not your reading of the situation?
No, certainly not. And in fact, those authors typically are sitting in the Northern Hemisphere that has massive control over South Africa's material, the stories that South Africans have to tell, a lot of the archive footage that you would have from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, from CODESA, from the lives of our political leaders who had to go into exile. All that material is already owned by a lot of those publishing houses that are in the global north. That is a fact.
Yeah.
So you wonder to yourself, how do we as a sovereign South African nation try to keep control over some of those things that somebody just came in and with the sheer might of their currency, they decided that they were going to own and control all that material. And as South African people, we are sitting here wondering, how on earth does a South African leader in the media, for example. You've got documentary filmmakers. Rihad Desai is a good example, who actually, in order to access material of his family's return from exile to South Africa, that he has to pay for that material to a foreign-owned news outlet. He's got to access material of his own image and images of his own late father. He has to pay for that in order to use that in a documentary about his own family. If that doesn't strike you as strange and odd and unfair and grotesque in how we have lost control of our own stories, of our own image, then it has to be disturbing to you, and it certainly is to Saga, because here we are fighting for our particular interest, which is the right for South African actors to earn royalties.
Right.
And everybody's saying, oh, we would love for South African actors to earn royalties. Well, that's very strange, because I'm seeing organizations in South Africa that are saying, we want you to earn royalties, but we're not prepared for the bill to be passed. You've got South African actors acting alongside American performers, shooting on location in South Africa. The American performer is able to earn royalties, but the South African performer can't. And that just makes no sense to us. And that's why we are asking for a change in the South African copyright regime. We have to step up with international best practice, the best practices that already exist internationally, for some strange reason doesn't exist in South Africa. Now, why is that? Is it because that there are commercial interests that lie outside South African borders that are exerting themselves in our own sovereign lawmaking practice? How is that possible, that when South Africa tries to take control of its own lawmaking process, of the right for South Africa to transform its legislative framework, that the objections are coming from outside South Africa, that the objections that are motivated by commercial interests are coming from South Africa? They're coming from those organizations and those countries that have already extracted so much out of South Africa's economy, that they continue to exert that force and prevent us from autonomy, that's preventing us from the right to create our own laws, our right to overcome the legacy of apartheid that still sits in South African law today in the form of the Copyright Act of 1978, that sits in the Performers Protection Act of 1967. When will we as South Africans take control of our own lawmaking process so that we can exercise that self-determination, that autonomy that we need to take control of our right to earn, our right to own, our right to share, our right to help people who don't have access, to allow them access to materials that are so protected by copyright control that even those who can't afford it are forced to pay in order to satisfy the profits that need to be sent then to countries outside of South Africa. We have to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. There really is. There are two opposing sides, it seems, to this, Jack. And is it as a result of misinformation? I mean, even Netflix's a member of Netflix's public policy says the streaming platform supports the objective of the bill, but it is concerned it could be harmful to everyone, including stakeholders that government actually wants to protect. On the other side of that, a copyright consultant telling the publication Ground Up that this bill will benefit South Africans by taking us into the 21st century.
Yes, that's perfectly put. That is the polemic right there, because you have those organizations, and let's be very clear, Netflix traditionally was not supporting any notion to share or to distribute residuals to performers. It is exactly for that reason that the American Actors Union for most of last year, had to exercise industrial action in order to bring to the negotiating table not just Netflix, but all the streamers who are exercising their rights in the US and globally. In South Africa, Netflix is probably the biggest player when it comes to streaming. But certainly Netflix had to deal with an actual strike before they were able to say, all right, let's find a way to start sharing residuals. Netflix is not in the business of sharing residuals. They are not in the business of supporting an actor's right to earn a residual income for the continued use of the actor's image. So you have organizations like Netflix, and they're coming into South Africa, and they are here to create content. But content for them is profit.
Yeah.
And what we are trying to draw attention to is that you have too many international organizations like Netflix and many others who come into South Africa knowing that we are not a regulated industry. And that means that they don't have to explain why they're not sharing residuals or anything else for that matter. In fact, when Saga specifically asked Netflix for a meeting to discuss the actor's right to earn residuals, they made it very clear that we are not going to meet with you. And that's pretty much on record, and it's something that we keep reminding them of. So in the US, for example, and in most of Europe around the world, creative sectors like ours, where we produce film and TV, those are regulated industries. They are regulated sectors. They are regulated by unionization, regulated by collective bargaining rights. In South Africa, we don't have a collective bargaining right. We do not have the right to unionize. We don't have protection under labor laws. So where do we turn in order for some regulation to start to level the playing field? Well, we turn to Parliament. We turn to statute. We turn to what is already drafted in law, and we try to update that.
Yeah.
So Netflix now comes in to say, we know that you're not regulated. We know you don't have labor laws. We know you can't unionize. And no, we don't want you to update your laws either. Now, we have a problem with that, is that we have to be able to draw the line in some way. We have to be able to exercise our right to speak to our own South African lawmakers to say, find protection for us, because otherwise we are lost. We cannot tell South African stories. We cannot create South African content that is authentic if you are offering us no protection whatsoever.
Yeah, certainly. A warning to all of us to read between the lines. Jack Devnarain, let me thank you for your time, the chairperson of the South African Guild of Actors. An important story that we're tracking for you.